Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Open Minds on Air, the official podcast of the Open Minds Foundation. Of course, you can find this show here at openmindsfoundation.org. I am your host, Pierce Redmond, and I am joined on the line once again by my co-host and friend, John Atack, who is, of course, the managing editor of the Open Minds Foundation. And we are also joined once again by Yuval who is on the research board for the, he is, let me try to get this right. He's on the review board. He is a part of the review board research coordinator. Is that even remotely close, Yuval, or did I butcher it once again?
No, I think, well, John would know better than me, but yeah, that sounds right.
Yeah, we've only just made these names up. He's our research coordinator, meaning that anybody who's doing academic research and who brings it to us with the idea of developing it, Yuval would be their first port of call.
Yep.
Excellent. Well, yeah, we'll go with that. We'll hopefully I will perfect that introduction the next time we talk.
Yeah.
But we thought that the three of us would join up again today. And kind of dive into some of the stuff that we began to touch on a bit, talking specifically about some of the research that you've been working on, Yuval. And this is, I think, something that people are going to be really sort of fascinated with. And John, you have talked about this with me before on my radio show, but it'll be really fun to actually hear Yuval kind of talk about it. But let's kind of get into this. I mean, one of the things that we sort of touched on the last time we spoke is this sort of this concept of awe and how this can kind of lead towards someone kind of losing grip maybe with what's going on around them. It can kind of isolate them. It can kind of I don't know, maybe sort of like stop critical thinking or make it somewhat obsolete. So, Yuval, why don't you kind of explain a little bit more in depth and what your research into awe is about, and maybe even just sort of explaining what awe is. I mean, I think this might be something that it can be one of those words that everyone sort of knows. I know what it means, but if you try to describe it, it becomes very difficult. So, Yuval, why don't you kind of describe it for the listeners?
Okay, so awe is an emotion, which is a problematic term in itself, because there's a lot of different theories about what emotions are, where they come from, etc. But awe is a very specific and interesting kind of emotion, and because it involves a feeling of knowing, which are a certain set of feelings, but let me say that I think that awe is closely related to the emotion of love. More specifically, parental love, so parent to child love. Now, when it comes to parent to child relationships, the emotion, the love, the what people feel is just one aspect. Right, because there's also the state of being in love, which can also be in a parental or romantic situation, and that is not an emotion. That is a psychological state that you are in, and you can be in it for months, for years. It can manifest as infatuated love. So a parent to a child who is injured, for example, and so the awe, I would say, corresponds to the emotion of love. Fervor would correspond to the state, the long-term state of being in love, and I'll talk about how those relate to each other. And I think that in both cases, there's the event of either falling in love, in the case of love, so a parent who, or a person who adopts a baby and becomes a parent, they undergo a certain psychological event. And I would say that event is related to a kind of a noetic experience, a sufficiently strong awe experience, which can trigger conversion. So a conversion is when you change your ideology or your worldview in a very short time. and falling in love, for example, in a parental context, can also allow you to change your life completely. But in both cases, in the case of parental love, we see a blind spot, right? So a parent does not see some of the flaws in his baby. And in the case of people who have high levels of fervor or recently had a very strong awe experience, they might also develop a blind spot. But a very important difference is that when it comes to love, the emotion of love, it comes with a certain kinds of special feelings of knowing. So there's special familiarity, there's special certainty regarding the identity, and there's conviction. But when it comes to awe, there's an additional feeling of knowing, which is what Stephen Colbert would call truthiness. And there's also realness, real as opposed to fake.
Authenticity.
Yeah, authentic as opposed to inauthentic. That awe brings with it not only a commitment, a sufficiently strong awe event can bring about a commitment not only to, let's say, a group or a leader or something like that, but also a commitment to a truth value of a set of ideas. And that does not happen in the parental love context. So a person who adopts a baby and becomes a parent, they can undergo a psychological event that makes them really committed, long-term committed to that baby, and their life has been changed. But that commitment does not extend to a certain set of beliefs. Well, in the case of awe, I do believe that it does. So hopefully that was clear enough.
Yeah, no, I think absolutely. You want to jump in, John?
Yeah, that you start with awe or wonder, this profound
wonder, mystery,
emotion. And if you look at it in terms of a romantic relationship, it's that infatuation. The moment when infatuation begins, there'll be a sense of wonder. And we identify this as falling in love. As that process continues, an infatuation typically I've read lasts from 6 to 18 months, which I think is very sad indeed. But in a relationship, it means that you don't see any defects in the person. Your partner's feet aren't too big and they don't smell, and you amplify what you like and you see what you idealize in that person. The ideals that they fulfill for you, you believe, and you minimize anything you'll disagree with. So, in a romantic relationship, when people meet, the one says that the other is spontaneous, but 2 years later they were saying, well, I've left them because they're impulsive. And they're describing the same quality, but seen through the lens of awe, wonder, infatuation, it becomes a positive thing. And the object of awe or affection is seen in that sort of light. That then it develops into a fervor, a connection, which is like the being in love, that you're maintaining a state. And there's a sort of unconditional positive regard that often comes into that. And as Yuval says, these are feelings and behaviors that we have within us, but we then attach them in a different way. So that in meeting some kind of teaching, there's often an awe experience at the beginning of a conversion, a cult conversion. When people went to see the first Methodist preacher, John Wesley, back in the 18th century, they would go into a state where they would actually twist round several times. They'd turn circles and fall to the ground in the stupor and then rise up believing that they had now been saved. Whether they were or not, I'm not equipped to judge. But the pitch that they were given to lead up to that was that hell was a dreadful place, and he was going to tell you all about that, and heaven was a wonderful place, and he was going to tell you all about that. And as you're walking home tonight, you could drop dead. And if you haven't made your choice, so an experience of awe was induced, and being in a group of people who are experiencing this, it makes it more likely that you will experience it too. And there may even, be a purely physiological set of reactions in us, almost like a swarm behavior, something beyond even a herd behavior, where, like starlings all turning on the wing at the same moment, human beings in a group will tend to have these awe experiences, which you can see at a rock concert, which you can see at a boxing match, which you can see on the battlefield. When a group of people do something together, there is this sort of surrender to the group. And a part of that, it's often kind of shoehorned in through an awe experience. In cults, it might be a meditation where you suddenly see a light around your master or what have you, your guru. But it's often an induced experience, which then leads to a series of consequences, which Yuval is well equipped to explain.
Yes.
Well, yeah, pick it up from there, Yuval, because there's also just the we're almost kind of getting into, like, for lack of a better word, like miracles. How a perceived miracle can be used to not only create some sort of extreme fervor or dedication to a belief or an ideology or to a person or something, but this can kind of shut down your critical thinking. And I think it's one of those things where, and again, I'm not trying to knock, like, I don't know, a true religious miracle or religion in general, because obviously atheists and scientists are totally susceptible to any of this sort of stuff. And, the awe that we give to science can cloud your thinking on a number of issues. But it kind of flesh this out a little bit for us, Yuval. I mean, and particularly this sort of, the idea of, like, an event that we could consider a miracle and how that can be used in order to manipulate further.
Okay, so that brings you bring us the into the following question of what brings about awe, right? Because the triggers, if I will tie this up to love, we see that in the case of parental love and romantic love, there's very different kinds of triggers that bring about the love emotion or the falling in love event. But when it comes to awe, I would characterize anything that is judged to be sufficiently anomalous is can bring about awe. Now, one of the
let's just hang on with. Can we just hang on with sufficiently anomalous? That is something that is odd, strange, at the edge of your comprehension. And so in watching a conjurer perform a trick and going, how on earth is he doing that? You're moved into an anomaly that is sufficient to take you into the next phase of Yuval's scheme.
Yeah. Now, many of the ways that many times this anomaly comes, for example, in the form of vastness, right? So if you observe, if you have a very vast experience, you see a grand view, you think about the cosmos, the galaxy, and something like that. So that can trigger awe. Also, if you think about infinity or eternity or really, really ancient things, those can sort of be a vastness-induced awe. Another important way to get awe is through celebrity. Just meeting a celebrity, and this can be a real meeting, or it can be a felt presence where you feel like a god was present with you. But sort of if you meet Mick Jagger, or he walks into the room, suddenly you might feel spontaneous awe. Now,
we might remark, isn't he small?
Yeah. So if you swim in the ocean and you see a whale, you would get a vastness-induced awe. But they would be very similar to if you meet a celebrity. So it's strange that Mick Jagger and a whale would create sort of a similar experience in you. But another thing which can be sufficiently anomalous, of course, is a miracle. And I think that one of the key things to understand is that there is no connection between the miracle and the conclusion that people draw from having seen the miracle. So if you look at the biblical miracle of walking on water, where Jesus walks on water, you can, in the story, the disciples who are on a boat on the lake that he's walking towards think that the miracle that they're observing proves that ghosts exist. And so until Jesus makes it to the boat, they think that they're seeing a ghost or a spirit in some translations. And they start freaking out. But then when he shows up to the boat, he says, no, actually, this miracle doesn't prove that ghosts exist. It proves that I am Jesus, the Son of God. Right? So
those aren't quite his words, and we better point that out before our listeners start to complain. But that is the presumption that is taken from the event, that because a miracle has been performed, therefore this is the God present on earth. An assertion I don't believe that Jesus ever made, Yuval. Made by John the Baptist, I think.
That's right. Yeah, but he says that I am Jesus. It says I can walk on water because I am Jesus. So you can see how the same miracle can prove, a person today, let's say a person today walked on a lake, that can prove that Islam is correct, that Buddhism is correct, that Christianity is correct. There is no connection between the miracle and the conclusions that people draw from it. So what happens is people see something that they judge to be sufficiently anomalous. And when I say miracle, I am an atheist, so I'm not actually referring to what might actually be a miracle, but I'm referring to what people perceive to be a miracle. But when people perceive that, they can see that as a proof of things that are not directly related to the miracle. So
in a cult group, somebody comes in, they sit down, they meditate for the first time in their lives, that they're looking at the wall and they start to hallucinate. They get the Ganzfeld effect, as it's classified, and they start to feel euphoric, and they will therefore go, wow, whatever this guy's teaching must be great, without realizing that this is what they're doing is staring at a wall. Whatever we call it, if you stare at a wall, this will happen to you. But if you don't know about that experience, it's an anomaly, an irregular occurrence in your experience. And because you feel high, you feel euphoric, which again is quite typical. If you sit still and stare at a wall for 10 minutes, you'll probably, for most people, they'll start to feel a little bit euphoric, because the fixation of their attention will lead to a release of serotonin. It's really quite simple what's going on here. They'll feel good. And then they'll say, well, what do I teach? And they will then pay the money over, and the teaching is true because they had an experience. But the experience is not in any way connected to the teaching.
Yeah. So now this is within a context, but even without, this is when the experience is sort of induced within a cultic situation. But you can have it even without that. You can have a situation where, let's say there's a miracle, for example, someone drops a bowl of sugar, and in the sugar spilled on the floor, the word the truth is spelled out. And you can have different observers that are, you can have 3 different atheists. One of them will see this and say, oh my God, I guess Hinduism was correct the whole time. The other one might say, I guess Islam, I guess I really do need to pray towards Mecca. And the third person might say, there must be magnets, or was I hypnotized, or they might, remain.
They might say Richard Dawkins was right.
Right.
Yeah, and
the spaghetti monster is controlling this.
No, not the spaghetti monster. Come on.
So
some things are religious.
So the way I refer to it is that you can have people that have a faith candidate. So a faith candidate, or maybe a proto-faith would be another name, is what you will conclude if you see what you consider to be a miracle. So there are atheists that, with the faith candidate of, let's say, Christianity, but there's also Christians with a faith candidate of Christianity. So if they see it, they will become a lot more. They'll maybe become born again. Their level of fervor, and I'll talk about what fervor is in a second. But the sufficient anomaly can make you see that the faith candidate is true now, or what will feel true to you.
Believe true, yeah.
Yeah. And so with the context, you can have someone that normally, if they see a miracle, they will become a Catholic. But now they're visiting India. They went into this ashram, and they know that everybody in the ashram believes that the guru is God. And then, they ask if they want to do some meditation, because that's supposed to be healthy. And, after 5 hours of staring at a candle, they start hallucinating. Now, because of the context for their stay at the ashram, their faith candidate has changed into the guru being God. Now, it's very easy to change a person's faith candidate because you don't actually have to believe it. You still need the miracle, right? So for me, if right now if I see a miracle, sufficiently affecting me, I might think one thing. It's easy to change people's faith candidate to something else. And so you can temporarily create a faith candidate regarding, for example, Scientology, and then make people have the very, very strong awe experience, maybe triggered by a miracle, but also it can be triggered by drugs. It can be triggered, as I said, by vastness, by celebrity, by a crowd, which can amplify the whole experience.
By skill,
trauma.
Yeah.
Right. So John Wesley would traumatize people by telling them how horrible hell is, which could also elicit awe. And trauma, death in the family,
sexual experience.
Yes, and also falling in love.
Good or bad. Yeah.
And falling in love romantically can be sufficiently anomalous to induce awe, or also parentally, right? There's people who say that every baby is a miracle, and we should treat it. We should be in awe of the embryonic process. And we should be, but that's more biology related.
Not just in humans, in all of the mammals.
Yeah. But that's more biology than religious psychology.
Be in awe of it. It's a miraculous thing.
Yeah, and so now so far we've been talking about awe experiences and the way that awe experiences can be seen as proving a set of beliefs, but to finish the fervor feedback, which is what I refer to fervor as a kind of feedback, you need behavior. So what happens is that you can have experiences, very strong awe experiences, let's say caused by a miracle or vastness or something. And that makes you believe in a set of ideas, that those set of ideas are true. And it's not just a set of ideas, it can come with an identity, all sorts of stuff. But those ideas that you believe in can make you behave in ways that will bring about additional awe experiences. And then you have a closed feedback loop. So the experiences prove beliefs, the beliefs cause behavior, and the behavior induces further experiences. And when you have that feedback established, the strength of that feedback, I argue, corresponds to the level of fervor that a person might have in that set of ideas, regarding the set of ideas that I believe in. So I hope that's clear so far.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And again, such a fascinating sort of topic and subject here. Let's get into, though, past this, though, how is this able to completely kind of affect one's critical thinking? And Yuval, specifically to you, are we all kind of susceptible to this? You know what I mean? You gave a wonderful example of like 3 atheists that could see something and instantly be, oh, damn, I guess Muhammad was correct, or, oh my God, this means that, whatever, that Hubbard is correct. It could be anything.
Yeah.
You could convince any. Now, is this just something that's sort of inherent to all of us, that we're all sort of susceptible to an awe-like experience or a miracle? It seems as if something is truly spectacular enough, you can convince somebody. But is this something that can happen maybe in like a smaller sort of a way? I don't know. How do you feel about that?
So, first of all, regarding whether it's everybody can do it, so it seems that once the sufficient level of awe, the very strong experience has been induced, then it's very powerful. But I think in different people, it requires different amount of stimulus to induce that kind of an emotion.
Very much
also,
so. Yeah.
People who are already in a very high fervor situation, right? So if someone is a very high fervor Scientologist, to get them to have an experience that would convert them into a Moonie might be require a lot of manipulation, a lot more, right? So having high level of fervor, being in one cult proves you from being in other cults, for example. It might be. I think that anybody that can be manipulated by a baby, right? So if you are an adult and you are capable of becoming a parent, becoming that, changing your life drastically to accommodate a baby in your life, to care for someone in a parental way, I think that and it might be that there are certain people who are incapable of this. So, I don't want to say that it's universal, but it seems that among healthy humans, this ability to undergo those strong emotional experiences that create a commitment, an irrational commitment, in the sense that it's not based on cost-benefit consideration. I think that is universal. Now, of course, there are humans that are, that were raised by wolves and have no language, right? There might be cases where they are capable of the parental attachment, but not of the ideological commitment. But I think that in most cases, it is humans have that ability.
Emotional arousal is significant to this. There are a very small number of people who are called phlegmatics, who recognized over the centuries, and they're pretty rare. I can only think of two that I've met in my life and got to know well enough to realize that they were phlegmatic. They don't have emotional responses. They have flattened emotional responses. Tiny percentages of the rest of us, we have our different degrees of emotional arousal, and that makes us susceptible to feelings because, hey, that's what emotional arousal is. And the interesting thing for me is that it doesn't matter whether your heightened arousal is through something fantastic you think is happening or something dreadful that is happening. That emotional arousal somehow makes the cold, calculating reason disappear. That we have less space available to think because we have to fight, fly, freeze, or grab onto the moment. We don't have there is a diminution of reasoning that takes place when we're highly emotionally aroused. Of course, at the other end, if you're in a completely monotonous situation, tedium is a major weapon of manipulators, that if they can spout gibberish at you for hours and you sit there in this sort of half sleeping daze, that too is a very good way to bring you into a group, where awe can then be,
you can say that that's like the Ganzfeld effect, sort of, that by sensory deprivation, suddenly you will get sensory hallucination.
Yeah, fixation of any kind, but not monotony will do it. So you get, people going into trances because of the lines along the middle of the road as they're driving along. Because the monotony, the repetition, the fixation is one end of this, and the other end is the heightened emotional arousal, where people we want to be infatuated, we want to be in love. We know that the word infatuate means to become fatuous, to become silly, quite literally. That's what it means. But we love to feel that way. We love to be in love, and we want to see the world through rose-tinted spectacles. So we head towards this emotional arousal, and whether it's through drugs or sex or rock and roll, or singing and dancing in the name of the Lord. However people rouse their emotions, they're rousing them towards a state of awe. We want to feel this awe. We want to have this powerful, overwhelming, wonderful sensation. And we sacrifice our reasoning at that point. We check it at the door.
Well, not consciously or actively, but it's sort of the desire to feel awe is like the desire to feel love or to be in love. But with the state of infatuated love, you get a blind spot. When you see the miracle and you see things which are the really real, you see what you consider to be absolute truth, you need to develop with it a blind spot regarding everything that contradicts that. So in the case of love, in romantic love, in Tenov's book about love and limerence, which is a term she invented for infatuated love, she talks to someone who says that it's such a wonderful thing that her boyfriend is unattractive, because that means that he's less likely to leave her, or that other women are not going to try to steal it. So there's this you can justify anything, you can rationalize everything, and you develop an actual blind spot. Now, eventually that blind spot usually gets replaced by willful ignorance. So maybe at the high fervor early stage, what they call the honeymoon phase of cult involvement, you actually have an actual blind spot where you actually do not see things. But that can develop into a willful ignorance where you just decide that you do not want to know what a critic of your group says.
Or you don't want to realize that Ron Hubbard stank because his teeth rotted in his head. And the people who went and worked with him, it's one of the common observations. He had a mouthful of rotting teeth. That doesn't smell good. And people zoned that out. So people who were with him will forget to mention that aspect because the infatuation precludes recognition. But as Yuval says, it's willful. The person decided, we're saving the world, we're making everywhere wonderful, and we just have to kill some people to do that. That's okay. Things become very confusing. And the balance of reason goes that we are looking to confirm what we feel. We're looking, to believe in the dogma, the teaching, whatever, believe in this other person. And again, in a relationship with a narcissistic person, a very selfish person, the person in that relationship will make all sorts of excuses for the bad behavior. Oh, he doesn't really mean it, when he hits me, it's just a reaction. It's because he had a hard childhood.
I upset him.
I'm sorry?
Or I upset them. That's why it was my fault.
Yeah. And you will find that the induction of guilt is a perfectly normal aspect of predation, that people who've been bullied and abused and had all of these tricks played on them often come away feeling, if only I'd been a better person,
in researching this, have you found that people tend to chase this sort of feeling, that it becomes something that they're constantly sort of searching for? I mean, because I can see that with particularly like cult groups that employ like intense meditation or all sorts of things,
supposed
touching
counselor
on your chakras and things like that, that it becomes so euphoric that you need that over and over again. And I mean, do you find that it becomes something? And again, I mean, obviously, just another form of control. If there's a guru and only the guru can unleash this sort of, I mean, it sort of almost reminds me of like, people that are like Pentecostal parishioners, where they're speaking in tongues suddenly, or the minister or whatever will touch them and they'll faint. I can see that becoming this thing that you're constantly chasing. I mean, have you found that in your research? And again, I mean,
yeah.
I would assume this is only just yet another sort of form of control.
Well, so first of all, regarding the chasing of the awe experiences, I think that is something that is very typical of most teenagers, and I think that it's sort of a phase of life where that becomes very heightened. Now, in addition to that, there are people who are already are not seekers because they have found something. So they have a steady dose of awe that they get, for example, the high fervor Christianity, the Pentecostals. So every Sunday they're shaking on the floor of the church, and so those people might not be seekers, but it is very common, especially where I am now, for example, in Boulder, Colorado, where there's a lot of people who are seekers, and they're serial converters. So they're into New Age, and maybe for a few months they'll be into the chakras, and then after that they'll be into crystals, and after that they'll be into channeling.
Sure.
And so every once in a while they would get a new sort of thing that they would feel awe, that would draw their awe from. But the problem is that it's a little bit of, you're playing with fire, because you're jumping from one sort of source of awe or a group where consistent awe is induced, and if you do it enough times, you will end up in a group that manipulates that nefariously, and you can end up in a cult.
And it is something you can, to some extent, take control of. I mean, having spent time with Yuval, I had the good fortune to do that. He will look for a place that will induce awe in him, so that he can. We went to Orleans Cathedral, for example, and wandered around there in the middle of the night, which was grand. But we are, in fact, both by temperament, people who look for great. We want great music, we want great literature, we want great art, great architecture, great cinema, and that's a way of actually getting your awe quite safely, relatively safely. Whereas the cult hopping thing, where techniques are being used to induce the state, can actually be quite dangerous, because you find yourself attached in a relationship which is disorganized. The relationship is not there for your security and to support you and to make you a better person in some way you desire. It's there to exploit you. It's there to use your resources for the leader of the group. But the awe of itself is wonderfully good for us. So, following your bliss, as Joseph Campbell used to say, finding 20 minutes of your day every day to do something you want to do is probably very psychologically healthy. What happens with cult groups? I was asked by Collins years ago, to what is now HarperCollins, to write a book about transcendental meditation back in 91. And I spent 6 months looking into it, and then sort of went, no, they're horrible
exactly.
people. I'm already being harassed by one group. But one of the stories that I heard several times was about professional people who had taken to meditation with TM, and they were now spending every waking minute meditating, to the neglect of everything in their lives, their businesses, their children, everything. And what had happened was they'd plugged into an awe situation, where they could, and it's like a lab rat, pressing a lever to get cocaine, that they're just taken up by the pursuit of this thing, and spending time with, the varieties of cult hopper. Often what's being said is, but I felt great. I felt fantastic. And then after a few months, I decided I'd try Avatar instead. And then for 3 months, Avatar is the most incredible thing in the world. And then it's like, well, no, I'm a Branch Davidian now, or whatever, moving from one thing to another because it's not giving them the dopamine release that they search for. And I think understanding how we can regulate our own pleasure and not become the victims of our thrill seeking is also quite an important thing, because kids are not really taught how to enjoy themselves safely and properly. They're just given the internet these days, and who knows what's going to happen there.
We've been talking about this sort of awe experience in like a positive way. But there's also this sort of like negative experience that you can have, particularly in, say, a high control group or a cult, where you have like almost like a mental breakdown. And that can be interpreted as a miracle or something,
or a good thing.
Right, exactly, or a good thing. And one of the things that kind of popped into my head is like that in Scientology you do like a Purif rundown, and that can sort of have tremendously negative effects on people, or some of the more sort of crazy quote unquote therapeutic things that can happen in Scientology. And that can lead to a complete mental breakdown. But again, that is then embraced as a positive thing, right? I mean, this is like,
it depends how long depends how long it goes on for. In some cases, it does lead to a psychotic breakdown. And I have had cases of that. Long-term members of Scientology who on the so-called upper levels, the secret levels, will come apart. And I've met people that's happened to. On the purification rundown, you have, as you say, a program of running and then spending 4 hours a day in a sauna, taking gradually ever increasing quantities of vitamins. And when it was first run, they got the sauna temperatures wrong. And a guy I knew who was a black belt in two martial arts, taekwondo and karate, and a very sharp guy, went and did this thing, and he did it for nearly 150 days. And he kept turning the sauna temperature all the way to the top, because that's what it mistakenly said in the bulletin. And when he came back, the next time I saw him, he was in a wheelchair, and he was having tremendous difficulty actually talking to anybody, because I think his brain had been damaged by the exposure, simply by the exposure to heat and these astonishing quantities of vitamins, 60, 100 times what you would normally take as a megavitamin pill, tremendous amounts. And the experience they have is they believe that they're running out residual drugs from their bodies. So Hubbard said, well, if you take an LSD, it will have lodged in your body. And when you do this, you'll have trips. And I met people who had trips, and it always rather worried me because LSD is water soluble. So I can't see how it could lodge in the human body, given it's something, it's very unstable and it's water soluble. So 20 years after you've taken it.
Right.
And so I always, even as a Scientologist, felt that there must be some psychological process going on here. It certainly, but Hubbard was claiming it was a physical thing, that you've got all of these, if you've taken drugs at all, you've got them stuck in your body. I mean, he must be pretty much made of drugs by the time he wrote this. And there's no evidence that he ever did this program, and he was, massively overweight and smoked 100 cigarettes a day.
Oh, could you imagine? I mean, I would love to be a fly on the wall in the sauna for Hubbard in there.
But exactly as you say, people would have this experience, and it's a confirming experience. People would start getting what they believed was a suntan, because they were taking huge quantities of niacin, vitamin B3. And sometimes, and I did see this, you'd actually see tan lines. You'd actually see, where their sleeves had been or something like that. So there was some bizarre physiological process going on here. But that was then interpreted to mean that what you were doing was you were getting rid of drug residues from your body. I talked with a guy, he was a Scientologist, but he was also a Harley Street doctor, a very highly paid doctor here. And I said to him, I've read that B vitamins, if you took them in large quantities, could give you a hallucinogenic experience. And he said, absolutely, vitamin B1. It's well known in the literature. So, in fact, you're being given something that gives you this experience, which you're then attributing to your own sinful behavior in the past, because of course drugs Scientologists, contrary to Hubbard's behavior with drugs, drugs are absolutely verboten. You are not allowed to. You can drink up to 24 hours before a counseling session. You can smoke. You can take those kind of drugs, but anything else is forbidden. So you've been made to feel guilty about it. Now you're running it out of your body by this process. So everything's been twisted in its meaning. Where the seminar in Toronto where Yuval and I met, we had a toxicologist who analysed the purification rundown, and it's great. It's sort of like a 40-minute talk, and she goes through line by line Hubbard's description of it, and it was so matter of fact. It was so beautiful, So Hubbard would say, "Some research suggests," or something like this, and she'd go, "Some research suggests." That was in 1977. Nothing's been added in the 40 years since, So they're not looking for they're claiming to have a science, but they're not looking for anything too scientific here. Hubbard thinks this might be so for 40 years people do it without bothering to do any more research.
Well, yeah, of course.
I think that if we return to the question, how sort of both a positive experience and a negative experience, I think that there's a number of those paradoxes that seem to and of course everything that John said was absolutely right regarding the framing and everything, but there's also an aspect that if we look at the counterpart regarding love, we can see that a parent can become infatuated with their child when the child wins a great award, right? The child is a great source of pride that can make the parent infatuated, but also the child being injured can make the parent infatuated with their child. And so you can see both the negative and the positive in the parental love, and also other kinds of love, can play a role in increasing the level of infatuation. And so I think that similarly, you can have a very good experience when you go to a church, or a very bad experience where you were terrified of hell or something, and both can increase your fervor. Now, another this kind of riddle that becomes more clear when you think of it in the context of love is how the same awe experience, a very strong awe experience, can make you believe in your faith more, or the same experience can make you leave your faith and join another faith. And I think that is similar to the way falling in love is the way that a family starts, right? When a couple falls in love romantically with each other, but also falling in love is how a family can end, when the mother falls in love with the milkman, for example. And so we can see that the context and the situations and the assumptions and the expectations play a critical role in the way these experiences are experienced and the way the conclusions that people draw from them, etc. So
beneficial or detrimental.
Yeah.
But it's they're the same feelings, and we don't want to be suggesting that people should just sit around looking bored all the time. That's not the solution. We should harness these feelings so that we can use them beneficially rather than detrimentally.
Now, the one of the analogies that I use to describe cult members is that they're in a way similar to parents of horrific children. So if your child is, Charles Manson or some horrible person, and your child abuses you, and he takes all your money, and he has cancer, so you have to work all day and all night to help him, earn money for his treatments, and you lie on his behalf, and you don't see, or you refuse to see that he's a criminal, but you also harbor him. You also break the law for him. And then if that kid dies, then you are completely devastated. And if we look at such a parent that behaves in such a way, we say, that's the power of love. Even if Hitler's parents, even if they were devastated when he passed away, I can understand them. They're the parents of that horrible person. But when a cult members behave in a very similar way, so the cult member who gives all their money to the cult, gives all their time to the cult, does not see the criminality of the cult, breaks the law for them, and is absolutely devastated if something happens to the cult or if they are kicked out of it. Regular society might consider that person as just a gullible idiot. Why were, they shouldn't have been that gullible. But just like the parent of the horrible child, we should understand them, and we should not think that just because there are parents who are manipulated by horrific children that really, really ruin their lives, that does not mean we should not enjoy love, and we should not enjoy parental love or other kinds of love. There is a good there is a good way to, and the regular way for love and awe manifest. It's usually a very positive thing. It's just that in the hand of manipulators, sometimes love, sometimes in romantic love, where one partner would manipulate someone else because of infatuated love, and then you can have people that wake up a few years later saying, "Oh my God, how did I end up in a relationship with such a monster? How could I not see it?" When we have that, we're not arguing against love. We're just arguing against the potential of manipulating both love and in the case of cults, awe towards negative ends, and which is something that people should be aware of.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, and I think this also just sort of harkens back to some of the stuff that we touched on in the first time the three of us talked. But I mean, there's a fine line between all of this. There is, as we were saying, I mean, we're not trying to dissuade people from doing things that induce awe, because again, we're doing that all on a, when we watch a TV show that we love, when we go to a movie, when we date someone, I mean, there is a positive aspect to this, but I think it's really about being fully aware of this. And I think also in terms of being aware of when your awe is being manipulated, when the event that you are seeing is maybe not quite what it seems, or it's being interpreted for you by an individual or a group, so that you have a particular response to that. So, again, I mean, you could see, we could go back, Yuval, to your example of, the bowl of sugar falling over, and, the word truth being displayed there. I mean, anyone can kind of come in and step in and tell you, oh, this is what it really means, and therefore you should follow me, you should give me all your money, you should cut off all ties with your family. So again, it is about just being aware of all of these things. But a fascinating conversation with the two of you is there anything that either of you want to leave the listeners with this episode in terms of what we've been talking about here, or just anything in general about the topics that we've brought up?
Go ahead, Yuval.
Well, there's I've said so much, and I could go on various tangents, but I think I've maybe one thing to add would be that people who have had an awe experience, and they see things the really real, they might end up using what I call argument from strangeness. And they would say, if Hubbard was not the Satan, that started, the source and all of that, how could you explain this or that? And so that would be, if it wasn't for something really strange, how would you explain something that's completely unrelated? Or, so the infinity is anomalous, or the world was created, therefore God exists. Or I saw I found a watch on the moon, therefore God exists. A Muslim God specifically exists. So you see this kind of argument that something is sufficiently strange, therefore something that's completely unrelated, and just that to notice when those come around. I think that's another thing that someone might benefit from.
True enough.
Excellent. John, anything you wanted to add?
Yeah, it is important to emphasize that I talk with many people and have seen quite a variety of websites that tell me that if I have critical thinking faculties, then I'll never be taken in by a con man or a cult. And critical thinking is vital to human life. But in fact, it's very easy to take extraordinarily well-educated and clever people into scams and schemes. They fall for them the same as anybody else. Lawyers, I knew a number of lawyers in Scientology. One of the most famous trial lawyers in the US, Earl Cooley, was a Scientologist. It didn't protect him. I knew NASA scientists in Scientology. It didn't protect them, because you need to have a union of good, healthy skepticism, critical thinking skills, but grounded in an understanding of normal, everyday human psychology, how we work, how we behave towards one another, with a wider understanding of that. But a particular reference to what Yuval has been talking about, noesis, the sense of certainty, the feeling of being sure about something. I think that's something that we all need to go away and think about from time to time. Why do I believe this? Why am I so convinced that this is true? And look at some of the unquestionable assumptions that we've built up over a lifetime, and the things it makes us queasy to think about, the views that we don't dare to challenge. For me, when I was in my 30s, I grew up in a very pleasant Christian household, very loving family, very moderate Christian household, nothing enforced, nothing cultic or unpleasant. When I said at age 11 I didn't want to go to church on a Sunday morning, actually because I wanted to stay in bed and get a bit more sleep.
Of course, yeah.
My mum didn't argue with me, so it was a very friendly sort of family. But I came into the world ill-equipped to deal with the predators out there and the liars out there and the people who are taking you for a ride, because I was taught to be truthful and honest and trusting. And I think if we teach children to be questioning, we teach them to relish understanding their own behavior, and we teach them to find enjoyment and thorough enjoyment in the world that is fulfilling for themselves without giving over control to outsiders for more than a brief minute. I mean, when Yuval was over, we went and saw what's the movie called? Black Panther or something? What's it called? Is that
Black
it?
Panther.
Oh yeah, Black Panther. Yeah.
And we went and saw it in 3D and would drop down all of those holes. And it's just a wonderful experience physiologically, where your brain is no longer able to read where up and down are. As long as you leave that experience, satisfied with the experience, rather than ending up paying all of your money over to, David Miscavige in Scientology or somebody, then it's actually a very healthy thing to do. So let me underline that aspect of what Yuval's been saying, that all can be good for you.
Yeah.
Excellent. Well, thank you, John Atack and Yuval Laor, for joining me once again on Open Minds On Air. Thank you all so much for listening. Of course, if you enjoyed this episode and you want to learn more about the Open Minds Foundation, you can go to openmindsfoundation.org. We are on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook, and you can find all of All three of those at Open Minds F. So again, if you're on Twitter, just at Open Minds F. The same for Instagram, and on Facebook, it's just facebook.com/OpenMindsF. If you want to support the Open Minds Foundation, then please click on the donate button on the main website. If you're interested in listening to more of my work, then you can always go to porkinspolicyreview.com, where you can find all of that. And again, we hopefully by the time you're listening to this, we should be up and running on iTunes and a few other podcatchers. But if not, those will be happening in the very near future. Guys, thank you so much. And until then, we'll be talking to everybody very soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.